From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Along with Samantha Bennett and student intern Malia Walker, I'm Jeff Wickman. In this week's Cattle Report, Livestock Marketing Information Center Director and Senior Economist Katelyn McCullock provides an overview of the cash market for last week, including the futures and boxed beef markets, and discusses an analysis by LMIC that shows a pretty big difference between prime grade beef and the other branded and choice products compared to a year ago. Then Malia visits with K-State economist Greg Ibendahl regarding the key components that go into calculating cash rental payments. He explains why it's important for producers to consider their revenue and expenses, past and future profits on rented acres, and government payments. And in this week's wildlife segment, Samantha and K-State aquatics and fishery specialist Joe Gerkin talk about preparing farm ponds for winter. It's all just ahead on Agriculture Today. You're listening to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. I'm Jeff Wickman. Well, we start off the week with an update on the activity taking place in the cattle market with Livestock Marketing Information Center Director and Senior Economist Katelyn McCullock. In addition to providing an overview of the cash market for last week, including the futures and boxed beef markets, Katelyn discusses the current female beef cow slaughter, which, if the pace continues, a reasonable estimate would put U.S. female slaughter over 800,000 by the end of the year, resulting in a January 1 beef cow herd number down 4.8%. She also talks about an LMIC study that shows a pretty big difference between prime-grade beef and the other branded and choice products compared to a year ago. Katelyn, first off, just starting off with the overview of the cash markets for the last week. What did we see there?
So the five area live steer price jumped up to about 152 most of last week, which is fairly exciting. We've been hanging around that mid 140 range for a while, so a little bit of uptick there as we head into the holiday season. In terms of the futures market, fed cattle ended the week on a high note. The December contract increased $1.30 on Thursday of last week, and most of the outlaying contracts were up as well. On the feeder cattle side, very strong week. All the feeder cattle contracts out through first part of 2023 are above 180, 100, and past then we're looking at over $200 a hundredweight through, August through about the November contract. So some pretty strong prices there. They ended the week on Thursday. Most of them were up more than $1.50. So a little bit of strength there.
In terms of boxed beef, what are we seeing there?
So boxed beef has been holding this 264 range or so on the choice side, and about 230, 235 on the select side for the last week or so. It's been interesting to watch different primal values. The chuck's been very strong. The rib primal, very strong. This time of year, we typically see a very strong rib price, and at least the last couple of years, that price has been exceptional. One thing we've been looking at is the difference between the rib primal value across the different quality grades. So if you think about prime, branded, choice, select. Now the prime category last year hit a record high of about $750 a hundredweight during this time of year. And we are right there again. So the prime rib primal value is about $750 again this year. And that's interesting because of where we are from a consumer standpoint in terms of the general expense people might be feeling from inflation and rising costs elsewhere. And you can see a pretty big difference between that prime graded beef and the other branded and choice products. So every other branded, choice, and select, that rib primal value is actually below last year. So a little bit of interesting dynamics there. It looks like we're seeing probably a little bit more restaurant demand this year, and probably a little bit more interest in having things like conferences and holiday parties and those types of things that might feature that kind of product.
So we may be seeing a little bit more of a shift back to some of the consumer practices maybe pre-COVID?
I think that's definitely part of it. The prime aspect, that's typically where you might see that movement of product, and that's where I'm pointing to, whereas maybe at the grocery store level, consumers might actually be shifting away from some of the higher quality grades at the retail space.
You also track some balance sheets as well for calves and cattle?
Yes, so we actually updated our forecast for out through 2024 last week, and so we've been looking at this beef cow slaughter number, which has been very strong all year, but we were really anticipating maybe a little bit of a slowdown. But the last 3 weeks, beef cow slaughter nationally has been over 80,000 head per week. That's an enormous number compared to history. And what that's forced us to do is look a little bit closer at what we anticipate that January 1 beef cow inventory number doing. And we've had to revise it quite a bit lower. So we're sitting at about down 4% year over year on January 1, 2023. And what that's going to do is that's going to shrink that calf crop a little bit more than what we had and boost those prices a little bit higher than what we had. And so for cow-calf country, you're looking at some fairly aggressive returns. We have cow-calf returns increasing to over $150 in 2023 per head and over $250 in 2024. Now, that's more similar to what you maybe saw back in 2013, but not quite the levels you saw in 2014 and 15. From a season average price or an annual average price on the calf side, we're looking at just over $200, 100 for 5 to 6s, and about $235 in 2024. Now, the key here is last year we saw this price really take off, and you had kind of a kinked trend line as the calf supplies got tighter and tighter. We don't know exactly when that timing is, but what we have in here is kind of this slower run-up, and we're expecting to see that big kink happening not until 2025. But it could be sooner, it could be later. It's a little bit of a feeling game right now. Things like drought, what weather looks like next spring, all are going to have an impact in that calf crop and what the beef cow herd does from here on out. And so things we're all watching. On the fed cattle side, we ended up revising prices up quite a bit higher as well, solidly in the 150s for an annual average in 2023, maybe even knocking on 160. 2024, a solid average probably in the 170s. So again, prices continuing to grow. And that's basically brought on by a pretty steep demand in the beef supply. So we have beef supplies pulling back about 5% on an annual basis in 2023 and another 7% or so in 2024.
Is there more to it than just, I guess, the price jump? Is there some other reasons why they're pulling back on calves?
So essentially what we are seeing right now is this is the time of year where all the bred calves are being preg checked, and any culling results are going to be probably reproductive decisions. Those animals that are pregnant are going to give birth this coming spring. And because we've reduced how many beef cows there are to get pregnant, we're expecting that calf crop to be a significant reduction. And so that's going to interplay into beef production in 2024 as well.
Possibility that we could be too short in that area then?
Well, the other side, so the supply side is generally supportive of price. The demand side remains our wild card. So I'm sure we've talked about it on the show before. If you're talking about world recession, price of energy, price of anything right now is very expensive, and how much that consumer makes different choices, especially in the meat case, but also as a general spending trend, are all going to matter in the coming years. So one thing I am very focused on is general spending trends in the fourth quarter of this year to set that tone. We have come back out of COVID and reemerged spending quite a bit. I think now the economic pressure of uncertainty and what's going to happen with the economy may start to play a bigger role. And even if you don't see it in the fourth quarter of this year, we're expecting retail sales, like things like gifts and those types of things, to probably take a hit this year. But probably first quarter of next year is going to see a significant pullback in spending, generally speaking, as consumers. You generally see that anyway, but it might be more of a shock than in years past just because of this uncertainty environment.
Any concerns over transportation issues, being able to move product?
You know, I think problem is now a relative term when we had COVID, right? Are we going to expect to see product stop? Probably not. There's always some transportation delays, whether it's weather or, different logistical issues. I think the big question maybe is, I'm sure some of your listeners have heard this storyline about diesel. If we did have some significant energy shortages or fuel costs such as that could potentially be a problem. And the world's transportation issue continues to be one that is maybe a little more out of sight, out of mind, but has impacted how we get inventory, how much is in store, how fast we can get it. And a lot of those have loosened up since maybe they were a year ago or less, but they're not back to where they were. And so transportation, I think, is continuously maybe an issue. And the problem we're seeing with livestock commodities, especially those that stay domestic, is the cost to move things like hay. So we are going to face regions that have significant hay shortages this year. We've already seen alfalfa crack probably a new record high this year, and other hay also do the same thing. When fuel is as expensive as it is, it just gets much, much harder to move those supplies around, especially of a commodity like hay that's not easily reduced in terms of volume, and it's heavy to transport and just doesn't necessarily move all that well.
Input costs, something that they're really having to keep a close eye on.
Input costs, that has been one of the big themes, I guess you'd say, in cow-calf country and impacting these culling decisions as well. Drought and any supplemental feed you might do. On the feedlot side, we haven't seen nearly as many problems. The feedlot side has really benefited from some pretty great fed cattle prices, and that's helped deal with some of those very high costs of gains seen in the last year or so. We do have break-evens creeping higher in 2023, and so you may see some red ink on the feedlot side in a few months, but most generally speaking, we have those fed cattle prices probably high enough and holding those 7 to 8 fairly steady as a result of higher cost of gains.
Katelyn, if somebody needs more information on what goes on at the LMIC, how can they find that information?
Please visit www.lmic.info.
That's Katelyn McCullock, Livestock Marketing Information Center Director and Senior Economist, providing this week's analysis of the activity taking place in the cattle markets. Again, for more information, visit their website, lmic.info. This is Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. For Samantha Bennett, I'm Ag Today intern Malia Walker. Joining us now in studio is Greg Ibendahl, K-State Farm Management Extension Specialist. So, Greg, welcome.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So, today we're going to be talking through cash rental rates. So, Greg, why exactly are these rates so significant to farmers?
Well, cash rental rates are a pretty big deal for farmers because about 90% of farmers do rent land. I mean, it's just too expensive to buy ground for most farmers. So, about 90% actually rent, and then a big chunk of the land they actually farm is rented ground. So about 80% of the ground they farm is actually rented too. So what happens in the cash rental market has a big effect on them just because it is such a big base of the ground they farm, and any kind of change in the cost either up or down can make a big difference to their bottom line.
Yeah, most definitely. Land is an input that's not exactly negotiable, and I would expect to be the most expensive input as well.
Yeah, typically we think that, and again, it is so expensive, and we determine that looking at past history that because land doesn't depreciate, really land by itself, if you buy it, you're not going to be able to cash flow it. So you almost have to have some land that you're renting really to support any kind of ground that you're going to buy. So again, it's very, very important for farmers, and they're going to pay close attention to what happens if they can afford to rent more ground or not.
Yeah, so I understand you created a survey that actually charts and reports these rates across Kansas?
Yeah, ours is really kind of more than a survey. So there are several sources out there farmers can use to look at what current rental rates are. Probably the biggest source farmers look at is the NASS survey, the National Ag Statistics Survey, that comes out every August. So really what they do is NASS goes through and they interview farmers and send out surveys, and it's kind of based on what farmers are currently paying. There's some issues with doing that, though. For one thing, they're looking at, past history, and they're looking at all the ground that farmers are currently renting. So it may not just be the current rental rates they're looking at. They could be looking at stuff that may have happened in the past, but it may not always be the best judge. And then you always have the issue, I'm sure farmers are mostly truthful, but, there is some incentives on these surveys really to report maybe a slightly lower rate just because you don't want to have your rates in your county go up. So there's always a question about whether those are actually good surveys or not. Our approach was different. We were going to go through and determine what can farmers actually pay when you actually look at all the expenses taken out, look at their revenue, and then maybe what's left over you can devote that to cash rent. So we're taking a whole different approach to what NASS does. They kind of complement each other, but they're really measuring different things.
You say say they complement each other. So what different things do you look at as opposed to NAS, and which factors ultimately determine your prediction for the cash rental rates?
Yeah, so what we're doing, we look at a whole bunch of things that go into this. So obviously we got to look at both the revenue side and the expense side. And the other thing we're trying to make sure we're looking at too is really when you look at rents, there really should be an expectation of future profits. Well, we have to kind of use past history to some degree to look at that too. So we're making some expectations about the future, and then we're also looking at some expectations of what actually happened in the past. So the first step would really be to look at the revenue side. So we're looking at really what's your production per acre as far as bushels. We're looking at the typical crop mix a farmer in a county would use, and then we're looking at both the prices that happened in the past and prices that we expect for the future. So that gives us the revenue side. And then on the expense side, we're actually using our Kansas Farm Management Association data, our KFMA data, to get the expenses. We have probably 1,000 farmers we're getting data from, and it's kind of scattered out. So we're kind of breaking our expenses out down to the crop reporting district. We're looking at what it costs to grow a typical bushel of the different grains that would make up a farm mix for a farmer in a county. And then once we figure out what those expenses are, we're kind of applying those expenses back down to the individual county level. And then we also have to look at government payments. That would be the third part of the big picture that goes into that. So crop revenue, government payments, and expenses, that actually then gives us a kind of remainder on a per acre basis, and we're using that as a guide then for what the cash rental rate should be.
Okay, so how do irrigated acres versus non-irrigated acres come into play in these reports?
That's a whole other part. So again, we have ground that's rented both for dry land and also for irrigated. So when we come to the irrigated side, we are actually really just looking at ground. We know how many acres in a county are irrigated. We're just assuming all those acres go into irrigated corn. We're not looking at any of the other combinations there. And this is where we actually have a big advantage over NAS, because NAS, when they do their surveys, they have to have so many farms in their survey before they can report that data. We're not constrained by that because we do know the reported irrigated acres. So even though there may not be enough individual farms to report an irrigated cash rental rate for a county, we know the irrigated numbers. We can actually apply my procedure back to some of those counties that NAS can't report. So I'm actually able to report a lot more counties for rented acres than what NAS can do.
Well, I'm no economist, but I would think that more reported data would be advantageous for producers. So how exactly can producers use these reports?
Well, again, so what we're actually doing with our survey was to kind of smooth things off a little bit. We're taking our approach with looking at the residual from net profitability. We're actually kind of incorporating the NAS numbers in that to give that a smoothing effect. Otherwise, our numbers would jump around quite a bit from year to year just because profitability can change so much. So just to get the idea that you probably do rent things on probably a 3 to 5 year basis, we're actually rounding it back to the NAS number and kind of getting a smoothing effect. But our numbers are going to be a little bit different than what NAS reports. So really, farmers can use our numbers, they can use the NAS numbers, and get an idea for what they think, where cash rental rates are going, and maybe what they can afford to pay. Because, there's several things affecting those surveys, as I mentioned. If you have a lot more farmers competing for ground, there could be the tendency in some counties for the rental rates really to be above what you can really support with the net farm income that you're seeing. So I think our approach really gives farmers an idea of what they can actually truly support, not just, what the demand for rental ground is actually pushing the market towards. So I think that can help things with the way profitability has been, even though we're probably looking at maybe a year where it's going to go down. The fact that we have had some really good years for profitability in the past, I think that's going to push our numbers a little bit higher than what the NAS numbers are. But again, there's kind of a delayed effect going on there. I would expect in future years our numbers actually could go below the NAS numbers too. So it's not always going to be above like you may have seen our numbers in the last couple of years.
So you touched on the potential for rental rates to go below NAS's. How have the numbers been looking for 2022, and can we expect to see rental rates fall in the future?
Well, even if you look at the NAS numbers, so they showed a pretty good jump in rental rates as well here. Again, NAS numbers, because it is kind of based on past results, it doesn't jump around as much as what profitability does. The NAS numbers were higher this last year, certainly not as high as what net farm income was going to be. But going forward, I think you're probably going to see rents probably start to stabilize. You probably saw a jump this year, both in our numbers and the NAS numbers, but with the expectations for future profitability, both in 2022 and especially going into 2023, I think you're going to see cash rental rates stabilize, maybe even start to go down a little bit in future years. But again, it's kind of so hard to say what's going to happen with profitability because so many things can happen to change that situation. But again, if you did a graph of graphing net farm income on a per acre basis based with the cash rental rates, you'll see a lot smoother effect on the rental rate side versus what the actual net farm income is going to be. But again, farmers can look at our numbers and the NAS numbers and get an idea of what they might expect to pay in the future that if they do want to expand or if a lease does come up for renegotiation.
Well, it's great to hear that there's potential for one of farmers' costs to be down in 2023.
Yeah, I think the fact that, maybe we can see the rental rates maybe going down after we get past this year, maybe. We're seeing all the other expenses going up, so having one not go up as much as something else, I think, would be a benefit for farmers.
Yeah, definitely. So, Greg, if listeners are tuning in and would like to utilize this resource or find some additional information, where can they go to find that?
Well, agmanager.info would be the place to go. I have two big publications, one for the dryland side, one for the irrigated side. Both of them are very detailed. The non-irrigated publication has all the details that go in behind that, so it has all the procedure about how we come up with net revenue and the gross revenue and the expenses that go into that, as well as the government payments, so that's all explained there. And then both publications have not only a table, but then they also have a color-coded graph in there that has, and we list the NAS numbers along with our projection of what rent should be for both for this year and what actually happened last year, too. So there's quite a bit of information in that. They are pretty detailed publications, so you can spend a lot of time going through that and seeing how we came up with our ideas for what rental rates should be.
It sounds like your survey reports both yours and NASA's information to provide a one-stop shop for producers?
Yeah, again, there's two publications, though, so make sure you look at the irrigated versus the non-irrigated side. And if you just start with the irrigated publication, you won't see all the details, so I kind of refer back to that one in there as well. But again, all that should be up on agmanager.info. You can search under our rental rate section, or you can just search under my name to find those publications.
As always, the resources we just discussed will be linked in the show notes of today's program. Greg, I know our conversation doesn't end here, and we'll be hearing from you again in the coming weeks regarding net farm income.
Yes, I'm currently working on a couple of publications. One, I'm getting ready all of the crop budgets to have them ready to go, which is kind of an estimation of what we think profitability is going to be on an enterprise level basis. But then I'm also working on a publication that'll be toward the end of the year where I'm looking at actually net farm income forecast for this year, and then also actually going into next year, even though I don't have any data for that yet. I'm going to go out on a limb there and kind of like the weatherman and make a prediction for what it's going to be. But, with 2022, we already have a pretty good idea for what prices are going to be and what yields are going to be, so I can get a fairly good idea for what income is going to be for 2022 at least. So that'll be coming out here toward the end of the year.
Well, I'll be looking forward to that, Greg. Thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Once again, that was Greg Ibendahl, K-State Farm Management Extension Specialist, giving us some insight into cash rental rates and what we may see in the coming year. Pull out your calendars and mark down Tuesday, November 29th for the Central Kansas Beef Summit in Salina, Kansas. The program will be held from 8:30 a.m. to 3 p.m. and will include a weather summary and outlook by Chip Redmond, a presentation on managing pastureland and grassland through drought by Doug Spencer, and a market outlook and update by Dr. Glenn Tonzer. Breakout sessions include an introduction of the Office of Farm and Ranch Transition, livestock risk protection and pasture, rangeland, and forage policy, and blue-green algae. To wrap up the program, you'll hear from a crisis management panel of media personnel, industry representatives, and livestock producers impacted by the 2021 fires. Again, that's the Central Kansas Beef Summit on Tuesday, November 29th. The cost to attend is $10 if you register by November 22nd. For more information or to register, visit centralkansas.k-state.edu/livestock/programs. I'm Malia Walker, and we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. We are back now with Joe Gerkin. He is our K-State Aquatics and Fisheries Specialist, joining us for this week's wildlife segment. So, Joe, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, we're going to talk about preparing farm ponds specifically for the winter. It's quickly approaching.
Yeah, we're moving into the colder months, so...
Yes, yeah. I got my windshield scraper ready to go, so...
It's good.
Yeah, but for our producers, they also need to be preparing, just in a different way. But first and foremost, really getting debris out of ponds is a great place to start.
Yeah, we've talked about that with the leaves and getting stuff like that out. It's important that we get out there and clean out our ponds as much as we can. Any large limbs, things like that you'd want to get out. Really make sure that your inlet and outlet pipes are cleared up. This is a great time of year to kind of do a little bit of maintenance there so they're not clogged up come springtime.
We've talked about feeding fish before in the past. Now's probably the time to start slowly stopping that?
Yep. So fish are cold-blooded animals, and that means that their body temperature is going to be a reflection of what their temperature of the environment that they're in. And so as water temperatures start to cool down, the fish start to cool down, and that means that they're slower. They don't need to eat as much. And if we continue to feed them, we're just adding nutrients to the pond that aren't getting eaten, and that's going to lead to more nutrients for plant growth in the spring. And so let's get a little bit ahead of that and just stop feeding fish now that the water temperatures are below that 55-degree mark. That's kind of the indicator.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've talked about it before, how that nutrient buildup leads to some issues in the spring. So getting ahead of it now, definitely a huge goal. But you also wanted to talk about aeration systems. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, we've talked quite a bit about adding aeration to your pond and some of the benefits there, keeping the water mixed up. That's during the summer months. Kind of the exact opposite happens in the winter months. And so water's most dense at 4 degrees Celsius, which is about 39 or 40 degrees Fahrenheit. And so what that means is the warmer water, that 40-degree water, is going to sink down, and the colder water is going to rise up. So that's why ice floats. But it's important that we keep that deep water as warm as we can so the fish can have a warm place to go so they don't freeze or die and have stress in any way. So we want that deeper water to be warm for the fish to have a place to go hang out and be safe.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes sense for sure. You don't want it mixing because then everything's just going to be cold, right?
That's right. And the other thing to remember is, the reason that we have that aeration, or one of the big reasons, is for the bacteria. So there's oxygen deep in the water. The bacteria stop really doing their thing around 50 degrees. And so when we're talking about colder temperatures, there's not really many reasons to keep the water mixed up. So let's turn off those systems, make sure they're ready to go for the colder months.
Absolutely. And you recently spoke with one of my interns, Malia Walker, about trout fishing, but that's not the only species of fish that needs to be harvested right now.
That's right. Malia is doing a great job. It was fun to talk to her. But as we move into these colder temperatures, a lot of us are thinking about, putting our fishing poles away. But there's still a lot of fun opportunities to catch fish, and this is kind of your last chance effort. We've talked about harvest and how if we don't take fish out of our pond, we end up with too many mouths to feed. So it's important to get out there, enjoy your last few warm days that we have, do some fishing, catch some smaller fish, and make sure we're taking those fish out. Remember, for bass, we need to be taking about 25 pounds per acre out of our pond. So it's generally a lot more than people think. So get out there, last chance to have some fishing before it's put away for the spring.
And I know, obviously, water sources have been greatly affected by the drought that we've had this past summer and into even the fall and winter now. So now's a good time to remember to have alternatives in place for livestock.
Yeah, so, we're talking about these ponds like everyone has them, and a lot of folks in Kansas are really dry. And so, but we do need to keep in mind that as it gets colder, obviously, a lot of the ponds tend to freeze over. It gets to be harder for cattle to get access to the water, to these ponds. So we want to make sure we have some alternative watering sources in place for livestock, things like portable water heaters, automatic waterers. There's even some geothermal options that are relatively cheap that are using the ground temperature to keep the water open. So making sure all that's in place, we don't get caught off guard by a really cold snap or something like that. Having water for our livestock, obviously our listeners know the importance of that. So just preparing for those days when we have some ice cover on our ponds.
That's not a fun chore, having to break water with an ice pick or something.
No, it is not. Getting out there with axes or chainsaws, that's a lot of work. So do your work now when it's a little bit warmer days. We're not necessarily thinking of it, but let's prepare so we are ready when it gets cold.
Absolutely. Well, some great reminders for producers for sure, Joe. As always, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Once again, that was K-State Aquatics and Fishery Specialist Joe Gerkin for this week's Wildlife segment. That concludes today's programming. We'll be back with more tomorrow on Agriculture Today.